In 1771, Thomas Hutchinson became the royal governor of Massachusetts. Most governors were British aristocrats sent for short tours of duty. Hutchinson, by contrast, was fifth-generation American-born with a long record of public service. He lived in the finest mansion in Boston. Wealth, power, and influence came to him easily. He prized his British identity and his fierce loyalty to his king. Alas, Hutchinson had the misfortune of being a loyal colonial leader during the tumultuous decades leading up to the American Revolution. He sought in vain to keep the interests of Britain and its colonies aligned. He promoted a plan of union to consolidate the colony's Indian policy. After his plan failed, the 7 Years' War pitted Britain and its colonies against the French and their Indian allies. The war ended with a great British victory and the elimination of French claims in North America. The British Empire's future had never looked so bright. Hutchinson believed that the British government's plans to tax the colonies to help reimburse the war debt were perhaps unwise but legitimate. Many Bostonians disagreed. As angry crowds protested the tax policies enacted after 1763, Hutchinson maintained his loyalty to the empire. He was a measured and cautious man who believed in order and tradition. Although he privately lamented the British tax policy, his sense of duty prevailed. He continued enforcing British law and became a villain to the growing revolutionary movement. When British troops occupied Boston in 1769, he wrote to a friend in England, "There must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties. I doubt whether it is possible to project a system of government in which a colony 3,000 miles distant from the parent state shall enjoy all the liberty of the parent state." Thomas Hutchinson venerated the British Empire, as did most English-speaking colonists in the 1750s. But the imperial policies following the 7 Years' War shook that affection and eventually shattered it completely. From 1763 to 1773, British settlers raised profound questions about imperial governance. Many came to believe that a tyrannical Britain had embarked on a course to enslave the colonists by depriving them of their traditional liberties. The colonists' invocation of terms like liberty, tyranny, and slavery inspired their passionate resistance in the 1760s and 1770s, but this rhetoric was a double-edged sword. The call to end slavery meant one thing when sounded by British merchants facing restrictions on commercial shipping. It meant something very different when sounded by African Americans locked in chattel slavery. From 1689 to 1815, Great Britain and France fought a succession of wars around the globe in a century-long effort to become the world's dominant power. The independence of Britain's North American colonies resulted at least in part from this great struggle, whose central turning point was the 7 Years' War. Americans called it the French and Indian War. However, a strong case can be made for renaming this conflict, fought on battlefields in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India, the First World War. This global conflict began in 1754 in the distant Ohio Valley, land variously claimed by Virginia, Pennsylvania, the French Empire, and more than a dozen Indian nations. In 1756, that backcountry struggle spread to encompass much of Europe, the Caribbean, and parts of Asia. By 1763, Great Britain had triumphed decisively over its enemy, defeating France in India, Europe, across the Caribbean, and permanently expelling French power from North America. It was the greatest victory the British Empire had ever won, and it remade the island nation into a global power. But that victory came at great cost, in money, lives, and desire for revenge by the losers. Great Britain's triumph ultimately laid the groundwork for the imperial crisis of the 1760s and the collapse of the First British Empire. For more than half a century, from their bases along the St. Lawrence River Valley and across the Great Lakes, French traders, missionaries, and officers had cultivated trade and diplomatic alliances with Indian peoples in the Ohio country who had migrated there in the wake of vicious wars and deadly epidemics. The French established a profitable exchange of manufactured goods for furs and other Native American exports. They supported their mostly Algonquin allies in their long struggle against the Iroquois to the east. Beginning in the 1740s, however, bold Pennsylvania traders began to infringe on the Ohio Valley and on Franco-Indian trading relationships. French and natives in the region could not tolerate these incursions. The Ohio Valley was, for the French, a crucial bridge connecting their strings of forts and settlements along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers. In response, French authorities sent a large contingent of French and Indian soldiers to build a series of military forts to secure their trade routes and to create a barrier against American expansion at the Appalachian Mountains. These efforts alarmed both the British and their Iroquois allies. In 1753, the royal governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, dispatched a messenger to warn the French that they were trespassing on Virginia land. For this dangerous mission, he chose the 21-year-old George Washington, a young gentleman and backwoods surveyor. It is worth knowing that young Major Washington did not speak a word of French, and while he passed a pleasant evening dining with Fort Duquesne's officers, during which he delivered his message that the French must not have realized that they were trespassing on British territory, he had to wonder what they muttered under their breaths between sips of good Madeira wine. It did not matter really, because this was part of the diplomatic back and forth that must precede either a treaty agreement or the outbreak of yet another war. Washington was politely informed that he and Governor Dinwiddie were mistaken, that the forks of the Ohio was French territory, and that the fort was going to stay right where it was and should not concern the British or the Americans in any way. Of course, upon his return he was commended for getting to the fort and back without incident, promoted to colonel, and ordered to mount an expedition to deliver a more forceful message to the French. In the spring of 1754, Washington set out with 160 Virginians and a contingent of Mingo Iroquois Indians led by the Seneca chief Tonnagreason. Their aims were identical. A year earlier, Tonnagreason had similarly warned the French to leave the Ohio country. As it would turn out, it was Washington's American Indian allies, not the Virginians or the French, who would drive events. Early on the morning of May 28th, Washington's militia and Indian auxiliaries happened upon a detachment of French soldiers encamped in a glen several miles south of Fort Duquesne. They were led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, and they were there because they knew Washington was coming, and Washington knew that he would be met by a French force that was not going to let him get near the fort. Washington's mission was not to launch an offensive against the French, merely to serve the equivalent of an eviction notice from the Ohio country claimed by Virginia on behalf of King George II and the British Empire. Tonnagreason had other plans, however. As the Virginians crept up on the French from the higher ground, Tonnagreason's men took up a position blocking any attempt at French escape in case of bloodshed, which he kept warning Washington was likely to happen, warnings that Washington dismissed. Someone in the French camp noticed the Virginians and raised an alarm, and somebody fired their musket. Nobody knows which side fired first, but this began a firefight that lasted for several minutes until both Washington and Jumonville could get their men to stop firing. In the meantime, Tonnagreason's warriors had swept in and attacked the French, adding to the confusion. But once the fight was over, Washington descended into the glen to parley with Jumonville, who, it turned out, had taken a musket ball to his thigh and was on his knees being tended by one of his men. Tonnagreason likewise was approaching Jumonville, but he was closer and reached him first. He seized the wounded man by his neck, and with the words, "Vous n'êtes pas mort encore, mon père," "You are not yet dead, my father." French and British colonial officers, by the way, encouraged Indians to think of themselves as children and the Europeans as parental figures, proceeded to rain several sharp blows upon the back of Jumonville's head with his war axe, and, as Washington described it, quote, took out his brains and washed his hands with them, end quote. Remember that this is Washington's first military command, and he had never seen combat before in his life, which explains why he had such trouble keeping everyone on the same page. Meanwhile, the Seneca warriors took this as a signal to begin slaughtering the wounded French, and it took Washington a few minutes again to restore order, but by now the damage was done. Jumonville was the only man Washington could properly speak with according to diplomatic protocols, and he allowed the surviving French to escape back to the fort while he retreated to a defensible position and built a crude palisade around his encampment, which he dubbed Fort Necessity, and waited for the inevitable French counterattack. It is worth mentioning at this point that the commander of Fort Duquesne was Ensign Jumonville's older brother, who learned from the survivors the only thing they knew. His brother had been murdered in cold blood by an Indian at the behest of Colonel Washington. He resolved to lead the mission to chase the Virginians down. A few hundred militiamen arrived to bolster Washington's force, but Tonagresan ordered his men to abandon the doomed Virginians. The colonel was a good-natured man, Tonagresan later said of Washington, but had no experience and would not heed his advice. Just over a month later, several hundred French troops surrounded Fort Necessity. A drenching rain had been pouring all the previous night and most of the day, and while the French had carefully kept the powder for their muskets dry, the Virginians had not, and could not mount more than a token defense of Fort Necessity before Washington threw up the white flag of surrender. He was taken to Fort Duquesne and offered terms that allowed him and his men to return to Williamsburg with their arms and their colors, exceedingly generous terms given the situation. Washington signed the document without reading it because, of course, it was written in French that Washington could not read, and which included an admission of direct responsibility for ordering the murder of Ensign Jumonville. When he returned to Williamsburg and the full scale of his blunder became clear, Governor Dinwiddie had Washington formally reprimanded and demoted back down to major, leaving Washington aching for an opportunity to redeem himself, but also with a burning hatred and distrust for Indians whom he blamed for the whole debacle. Tonagresan probably hoped the battle would inflame hostilities between the French and the British colonists. If so, he had succeeded. The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America, the British politician Horace Walpole later wrote, set the world on fire. British leaders hoped to contain the conflict to the Ohio country. One strategy was to strengthen the old partnership with the Iroquois Six Nations, who since 1692 had joined with New York authorities in an alliance called the Covenant Chain to foster trade and mutual protection. Unscrupulous land speculators had caused the Mohawks in particular to doubt British friendship, however. Authorities in London directed New York's royal governor to convene a colonial conference to repair trade relations and secure the Iroquois' help, or at least their neutrality, against the looming French threat. The conference convened at Albany in June and July 1754. All 6 nations of the Iroquois attended, along with 24 delegates from 7 colonies, making this an unprecedented intercolonial gathering. 2 delegates seized the occasion to present an additional proposal. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, both rising political stars, co-authored the Albany Plan of Union, a proposal for a unified colonial government with a president and a council to exercise sole authority over questions of war, peace, and trade with the Indians. No challenge to Parliament's authority was intended. Franklin commissioned the printing of a cartoon that appeared in colonial newspapers promoting the Plan of Union, addressing the fact that the British North American colonies were frequently at odds with each other, divided by petty rivalries and prejudices that would doom them in the event of a major war with France, which everyone at the Congress knew by then was almost inevitable. Delegates at the Albany Congress, alarmed by news of the Virginians' defeat at Fort Necessity, agreed to present the plan to their respective assemblies. To Franklin's surprise, not a single colony approved the Albany Plan. The Massachusetts Assembly feared it was a, quote, design of gaining power over the colonies, end quote, especially the power of taxation. Others objected that it would be impossible to agree on unified policies towards scores of quite different Indian nations. The British government never backed the Albany Plan. Instead, it appointed 2 superintendents of Indian affairs, one for the northern and another for the southern colonies, each with exclusive powers to negotiate treaties, trade, and land sales with all tribes. This initiative centralized control of Indian policy with officials accountable to London rather than the colonial assemblies. The Indians at the Albany Congress were no more impressed with the Albany Plan. The Covenant Chain alliance with the Mohawks was reaffirmed, but the other Iroquois nations left without pledging to fight with the British. Indeed, some of the Iroquois hoped that the French military presence around the Great Lakes would limit the westward push of American colonists, thus serving their interests. General Edward Braddock was dispatched from England to America with a few thousand redcoats to give the French a swift kick in the groin and take Fort Duquesne. Meeting with colonial governors and leading assemblymen, he ordered them to raise revenue to supply his forces and to muster their militias and put them under his command in a novel attempt to build an intercolonial auxiliary to the regular army. But the old rivalries and divisions between the colonies resulted in militias that refused to serve outside their home boundaries or to coordinate with the militia from other colonies. For instance, since Massachusetts and New Hampshire constantly squabbled with New York over the location of their shared boundaries, the New Yorkers refused to engage in any operations to defend New England, while Massachusetts and New Hampshire likewise refused to fight on New York's vulnerable northern frontier. Georgia and the Carolinas saw no need to raise money to fund a war against a foe that did not threaten their frontiers, the lower southern colonies being more worried about the Spanish and the Cherokees than the French and their Indian allies. The American colonists may have thought of themselves as British, but here they demonstrated just how American they had become. By 1755, George Washington's frontier skirmish in the most distant reaches of European empires was turning into a global war. The British expected quick victories on 3 North American fronts. General Edward Braddock marched his army toward Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania. Farther north, British troops moved toward Fort Niagara, critically located between Lakes Erie and Ontario. William Johnson, recently appointed Superintendent of Northern Indian Affairs, led forces north toward Lake Champlain, intending to defend the border against the French in Canada. Unfortunately for the British, the French and their American Indian allies were prepared to fight. Braddock's army of 2,000 British soldiers marched west toward Fort Duquesne, carving a road through 125 miles of nearly impenetrable Appalachian forest, and dragging cannons and heavy artillery across the mountains. On July 9, 1755, just 12 miles from their objective, Braddock's forces were attacked by 254 French and Canadian soldiers joined by a vast coalition of 600 to 700 disciplined and experienced American Indian warriors drawn from half the continent. It was one of the greatest defeats in British military history. In the bloody battle, nearly 1,000 on the British side were wounded or killed, including General Braddock. Washington thus found a way to redeem himself by taking command of the remains of the British and American Expeditionary Force, successfully leading an orderly retreat back to safety. There was little question at this point that Britain and France were back at war, but initially it was conceived in the same terms as the previous wars, and that is as a European conflict. The British Prime Minister, Thomas Pelham Hollis, the Duke of Newcastle, committed the bulk of military and financial resources to the war on the continent, while an army was sent to America with the idea that the colonial militias and allied Indian tribes would do more of the fighting there. Although British forces vastly outnumbered the French, British leaders stumbled badly during the first years of the war, deploying inadequate numbers of undersupplied troops. What finally turned the war around was the rise to power in 1757 of William Pitt as Britain's prime minister, a man ready to commit massive resources to fight France and Spain, which had joined the war against Britain. In America, British troops, aided by American provincial soldiers, at last captured Forts Duquesne, Niagara, and Ticonderoga, followed by the French cities of Quebec in 1759 and finally Montreal in 1760. By 1761, the war ended in North America but expanded globally, with battles in the Caribbean, Austria, Prussia, and India. The British captured the French sugar islands Martinique and Guadeloupe and then invaded Spanish Cuba with an army of some 4,000 soldiers from New York and New England. France and Spain capitulated in 1762, and the Treaty of Paris was signed the following year. In the complex peace negotiations that produced the treaty, France ceded its North American empire, while British sovereignty was confirmed from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. But French territory west of the Mississippi River, including New Orleans, was transferred to Spain, giving it a vast buffer zone for its lucrative Mexican colonies. Cuba was returned to Spain, and Martinique and Guadeloupe were returned to France. It was a spectacular victory for Great Britain and for the British settlers in America. The French threat that had loomed on the northern flank of English settlements for over a century was now gone. An upsurge of patriotism washed across the colonies as British settlers celebrated the glory of Great Britain and the fruits of their conquest. The Protestant British victory over its French Catholic enemies unleashed a wave of religious fervor. It seemed to presage the dawn of a new age. But these hopes were soon dashed. The great victory planted the seeds of future downfall. The continental balance of power that had shaped diplomatic, economic, and cultural relations among native and European peoples was suddenly upended. The loss of a French counterweight to the British unshackled the restraints on settlers' ambitions in the West, raising their hopes for land and wealth that would soon be disappointed. Religious expectations, too, were dashed by the mundane realities of governance and political conflict. And perhaps most vexing of all, the enormous expense of the war. By 1763, Britain's national debt had doubled in just 6 years to £123 million sterling, roughly equivalent to today's national debt in the United States, posed a formidable challenge to British leaders. How would those war debts be paid? Although native peoples from the St. Lawrence Valley to the Mississippi Delta had fought in the 7 Years' War, none were included or even consulted in the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Paris. As far as they were concerned, war had not ended. Minavavana, an Ojibwe chief of the Great Lakes region, put it succinctly to an English trader: "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors, and we will part with them to none. Furthermore," he noted, "your king has never sent us any presents nor entered into any treaty with us, wherefore he and we are still at war." The War for America took place in the midst of an unprecedented movement for pan-Indian unification and religious redefinition that I call the Great Indian Awakening. Starting in the 1730s, focused mainly in the frontier portions of northern and western Pennsylvania among refugee communities of Delaware, Shawnee, and other southern Algonquin and Iroquoian nations, a succession of religious reformers arose to address the weaknesses afflicting Indian country that had resulted in the progressive loss of land and political power. They all decried the heavy trade in animal pelts as a symptom of spiritual sickness and greed for European goods, particularly alcohol. They decried the dependence on Europeans' technology for everyday Indian survival. They especially decried the steady erosion of traditional Indian religious beliefs and practices, which had angered the Master of Life and led him to withdraw his benevolence and protection. The only way to restore Indian power was to recover the old traditions, which would please the Master of Life and reverse the decline. As the war ended in Canada, the French allied Indians failed to understand why the French had surrendered, and an Ottawa war sachem, Pontiac, began following the preachings of a Delaware prophet, Nowlin, who urged Indians to reject everything that the Europeans had brought to America, right down to muskets and metal tools. If they did, he predicted, the Master of Life would cause all of the white people to simply disappear back to their homelands, never again to return, and the Indians would have their homelands back and their old power restored. While Nowlin preached a single religion for all Indians, he did not advocate for pan-Indian unity, but Pontiac did. Whatever differences one could see among the whites, he said, they are easily put aside when it comes to exploiting Indians and taking their land. He urged all Indians to come together under his leadership to fulfill a part of Nowlin's prophecies by attacking the British and Americans. Resigned to the permanent presence of white people in North America, he hoped to bring the French back into a war that would mean the utter destruction of British America. The only way to do that, he reasoned, was with the continued use of muskets and steel weapons rather than going back to bows and arrows, which by that point very few in the eastern woodlands knew how to make anymore. He and Nowlin traveled throughout Indian country, and while many tribes joined them, and many more individuals from other nations joined, a grand unification of Indian country failed to materialize. In the meantime, supreme command of British forces in North America fell to Major General Sir Geoffrey Amherst, whose arrogance and tone deafness alienated him from nearly everyone who could have been helpful in stabilizing the frontier and repairing strained relations between British military and colonial civilian authority. Minavavana made an important point about the absence of British presence. In Indian diplomacy and trade, gifts cemented alliances, symbolizing honor and establishing obligation. Over many decades, the French had mastered the subtleties of this diplomacy, distributing goods on which their American Indian allies had come to depend, like weapons and manufactured items, and receiving fur, skins, slaves, and native goods like moccasins in return. British military leaders who were new to the American theater at the end of the war often discarded trade goods as trivial trinkets, insulting the very people they meant to court and displaying an astonishing ignorance about Indian diplomacy. Amherst himself declared, quote, "It is not my intention ever to attempt to gain the friendship of Indians by presents," end quote. The native view was very different. In the ceremonial practices of diplomacy and trade, generosity expressed power and protection, not subordination. France's former allies north of the Ohio River had cause for concern. As French officers turned their trading posts across the Northwest over to the British, their former enemies turned them into military bases. Fort Duquesne, renamed Fort Pitt, gained new walls 60 feet thick at their base. This was no mere trading post. Although the French king had abandoned North America, the transcontinental alliances the French had helped forge, along with the experience of continent-wide fighting against the British, had fostered a greater sense of unity and identity among disparate Native American people. A renewed religious fervor began to spread across Indian country, magnifying feelings of antagonism toward the British. Decades of war and dislocation of native peoples across the Trans-Appalachian West had set the stage for a religious revival. Onto this fertile ground stepped Pontiac and Nowlin. In May 1763, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Huron warriors attacked Fort Detroit, launching Pontiac's War. Their objective was to keep British settlement and sovereignty out of Indian country, and perhaps renew the war with French reinforcements. 6 more attacks on forts followed within weeks, and soon settlements across the backcountry were under assault. By the fall, Pontiac's forces had captured every fort west of Detroit. More than 400 British soldiers were dead, and 2,000 colonists killed or taken captive. The pan-Indian unity west of the Appalachians found a counterpart in a growing anti-Indian racism among settlers to the east. Some exacted revenge. The most violent aggression occurred in late 1763, when some 50 Pennsylvania vigilantes known as the Paxton Boys descended on a peaceful village of friendly Christianized Conestoga Indians, murdering 20. The vigilantes, now numbering 500, marched on Philadelphia to try to capture and murder some Christian Indians held in protective custody there. British troops prevented a further massacre, but the Paxton Boys escaped punishment for their murderous attack on the Conestoga village. In early 1764, the war effort foundered. The Indians, without their French allies who refused to join, were short on ammunition, and the British were tired and broke. The British government recalled the imperious General Amherst, blaming him for mishandling the conflict. His own soldiers toasted his departure. A new military leader, Thomas Gage, reversed Amherst's unsuccessful policies and distributed gifts profusely among the Indians to cement new alliances. To contain the violence, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which protected the integrity of Indian territory by forbidding colonists to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the proclamation's language also took care not to identify western lands as belonging to the Indians. While the Proclamation of 1763 referred to American and even French colonists in Canada as, quote, "our loving subjects," entitled to English rights and privileges, it described native peoples more vaguely as, quote, "tribes of Indians with whom we are connected," end quote. In fact, the British were not very well connected with most Indians, nor did they wish connections to form among the different nations. As Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Northern Indian Affairs, advised in 1764, quote, "It will be expedient to treat with each nation separately, for could they arrive at a perfect union, they must prove very dangerous neighbors," end quote. If the Royal Proclamation calmed tensions with native peoples west of the Appalachians, it provoked angry reactions among British settlers and land speculators who had staked claims to huge tracts of western lands. In addition, many officers and soldiers in colonial militias were offered grants of land in Ohio in exchange for payment in cash for their service. Making matters worse, the boundary proved impossible to enforce. Surging population growth among British settlers had already sent hundreds west of the Appalachians, where they squatted on Indian lands. Violence periodically broke out, leaving settlers fearful, uncertain about their futures, and increasingly distrustful of British authority. Some tribes split into factions over issues of peace, war, and alliance with competing European powers. Militants from different tribes joined forces in intertribal alliances, while at home they were increasingly divided from those who advocated a less militant stance. New communities formed as refugees from different tribes fled to safer areas or congregated in armed camps to continue the fight. Recurrent warfare produced repercussions on social and political structures. Most Indian societies in the eastern woodlands had two classes of chiefs. Older civil or village chiefs, often called sachems, guided the community in daily affairs and in reaching consensus on issues of importance. Younger chiefs with impressive military records led warriors on campaigns but relinquished authority when they returned to the village. Violent deeds had no place in kin-based Indian communities where, with no courts, police, or jails, social harmony was a common and necessary condition, not just an ideal. However, as war became a normal state of affairs and war parties came and went with increasing regularity, war chiefs exerted more influence in tribal councils. European allies bolstered their position with supplies of guns and gifts of medals and uniforms, and the number of contenders for such support increased. Civil or peace chiefs saw their influence decline. Those Iroquois people who moved into Ohio acted with growing independence from the Iroquois League centered at Onondaga. 10 warriors who traveled from the Ohio country to Philadelphia in 1747 explained to the colonists, quote, "The old men at the fire at Onondaga are unwilling to come into the war, so the young Indians, the warriors, and the captains consulted together and resolved to take up the English hatchet against the will of their old people, and to lay their old people aside as of no value but in time of peace." End quote. A group of Seneca warriors in 1762 told Sir William Johnson that they, not the sachems, had the power and ability to settle matters. The sachems, they said, were, quote, "a parcel of old people who say much, but who mean or act very little." End quote. Civil chiefs lost their ability to restrain headstrong young warriors, which had provided an important generational balance in many Indian societies, and the voices for war in Indian communities grew louder and less restrained. Generations of recurrent warfare left an indelible mark on Indian societies and cultures and helped create the stereotype of warlike Indians that Europeans and later Americans invoked to justify treating them as quote-unquote savages. In 1760, George III, just 22 years old, became King of England. The new monarch struggled to gain his footing. He rotated through a succession of leaders, searching for a prime minister he could trust. A half-dozen ministers in 7 years took turns dealing with one basic underlying British reality: the huge war debt needed to be serviced. It seemed reasonable to British authorities to expect that British subjects in North America, who were, after all, principal beneficiaries of the great victory, should help pay the debt. To many American colonists, however, that proposition violated what they perceived as their rights and liberties as British subjects. Eventually, their resentment erupted in large-scale protests. The first taxes were the work of Sir George Grenville, Prime Minister from 1763 to 1765. Searching for new sources of revenue, he focused on the customs service, which monitored the shipping trades and collected all import and export duties. He found that the salaries of customs officers cost the government 4 times the revenue they collected. The shortfall was due in part to bribery and smuggling, so Grenville began to insist on more rigorous paperwork and stricter accounting. He also set about rationalizing customs taxes. The hardest duty to enforce, he learned, resulted from the Molasses Act of 1733, which imposed a stiff tax on molasses imported to British colonies from outside the empire. Molasses was the central ingredient for rum, which British colonists drank in great quantities. Colonists had ignored the Molasses Act for decades, importing molasses from the French Caribbean islands, where it was much cheaper. Grenville's solution was the Revenue Act of 1764, popularly dubbed the Sugar Act. It cut the duty on French molasses in half, making it more attractive for shippers to obey the law, and raised penalties for smuggling. Although the act appeared to be in the tradition of the Navigation Acts, which regulated trade, its clear intent was to raise revenue. More ominously, the Sugar Act toughened enforcement policies, empowering British naval crews to board suspicious ships and seize illegal cargoes. Each colony had a chief customs officer who oversaw inspectors, and it turned out that some of them refused to leave Britain to perform their duties in the colonial capitals, shifting that responsibility to lower-paid underlings, most of whom could not resist the temptation to line their pockets with bribes to look the other way on violations of the Navigation Acts and the collection of duties. Inspectors could often be bought off as well. Grenville ordered absentee officials to properly assume their posts or be fired, and summarily sacked corrupt officials and inspectors, replacing them with men who faced harsher penalties should they succumb to temptation. American shippers and traders accused of smuggling, or of attempting to bribe customs officials, or of not paying import duties would no longer be tried in civilian courts where they would be judged by juries of their peers, as remained the case in Britain. In the past, shippers and traders accused of violations often got off scot-free or had their charges reduced, and this Grenville chalked up to the colonial merchant community looking after itself rather than putting the empire ahead of their interests. Instead, newly created vice admiralty courts, one in each colonial capital, would try offenders, and cases would be decided by a judge appointed by the king, not by any jury. In the English legal system, the accused are presumed innocent until proven guilty, but in the vice admiralty courts, guilt was presumed and the burden of proof for innocence was placed on the accused with predictable results. Grenville's hopes for the Sugar Act did not materialize. Despite the decrease in the duty, the tax was still too high to offset the profits to be made from smuggling. Meanwhile, the increased enforcement measures led to ugly confrontations in colonial port cities. From the perspective of British administrators, the Sugar Act was a reasonable effort to administer the colonies. To many in the colonial merchant community, however, the British law was a disturbing intrusion on colonial practices of self-taxation by elected colonial assemblies. In February 1765, Grenville expanded his revenue program with the Stamp Act, precipitating a major conflict between Britain and the colonies and raising profound questions about the powers of Parliament over British settlers in America. The Stamp Act imposed a tax on paper used for official documents, newspapers, pamphlets, court documents, licenses, wills, ships' cargo lists, and more, requiring an affixed stamp to prove the tax had been paid. Unlike the Sugar Act, which regulated trade, the Stamp Act had only one purpose: to raise revenue. Although it affected anyone who used taxed paper, the Stamp Act's greatest impact fell on the business and legal communities which used official paper in abundance. Anticipating that the stamp tax would be unpopular, Thomas Hutchinson had warned him, and not wanting the anger focused on imperial officers, Grenville delegated its enforcement to local stamp distributors appointed by the king. Each would earn 8% of the revenue collected as their salary. English tradition held that only the people's representatives in Parliament could levy direct taxes. This view that taxation required the consent of the people rested on an essential concept of English political theory, that free people have the right to enjoy and use their property without fear of confiscation. The king could not demand taxes, only the House of Commons could grant them. But this traditional view did not address the place of settlers in British colonies who did not elect representatives to Parliament. Could Parliament tax them? Grenville argued that taxation required the consent of the people, but he and his allies argued that the colonists benefited from virtual representation in Parliament. The House of Commons, he insisted, represented British subjects throughout the empire, whether or not they voted in parliamentary elections. Colonial leaders rejected this concept. They consented to local and provincial taxes levied by their town, county, or colonial assemblies, which funded public expenses like local roads and poor relief. By contrast, they argued, the stamp tax was a departure, a fee per document direct tax levied by a distant parliament on its colonies. When colonists learned of the Stamp Act in April 1765, 7 months before it was to take effect, resistance began immediately. It centered first in colonial assemblies. Virginia's assembly, the House of Burgesses, took the lead. At the end of its May session, after two-thirds of the members had left, Patrick Henry, a young political newcomer, presented a series of resolutions on the Stamp Act that became known as the Virginia Resolves. The first three stated the obvious, that Virginians were British citizens, that they enjoyed the same rights and privileges as other Britons, and that self-taxation was one of those rights. The fourth resolution noted that Virginians had always taxed themselves through their representatives in the House of Burgesses. The fifth took a radical leap by pushing the other four unexceptional statements to one conclusion, that the Virginia Assembly alone had the right to tax Virginians. Two more fiery resolutions were debated as Henry pressed the logic of his case. The sixth resolution denied legitimacy to any tax law originating outside Virginia, and the seventh boldly called anyone who disagreed with these propositions an enemy of Virginia. This was too much for the other representatives. They voted down resolutions 6 and 7 and later rescinded their vote on number 5 as well. Their caution hardly mattered, however, because newspapers in other colonies printed all 7 Virginia resolves, creating the impression of a daring challenge to the Stamp Act. Consequently, other assemblies began considering even more radical questions. By what authority could Parliament legislate for the colonies without also taxing them? No one in 1765 disagreed that Parliament had legislative power over the colonists. They were, after all, British subjects. Several assemblies, however, began distinguishing between indirect taxes imposed to regulate trade and direct taxes, such as the stamp tax or property tax, which could only be self-imposed. The colonial assemblies argued 2 points. The Stamp Act was an unlawful direct tax on Americans who were not represented in Parliament, and that each colonial legislature was equal to Parliament in dignity and authority within their boundaries. This latter point was based on the fact that each colony at its founding had been granted a charter by the reigning monarch and not by Parliament. Needless to say, this was not how Parliament or King George III saw things. If political debate about the Stamp Act began in legislative assemblies, it soon expanded to private sites like parlors and coffee shops, to public spaces like streets and docks, and into the printed pages of newspapers and pamphlets. Everyone whose livelihood required official paper had to decide whether to comply. The first organized resistance to the Stamp Act began in Boston under the direction of town leaders, including Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Ebenezer McIntosh. Adams, in his 40s, had shrewd political instincts and a gift for organizing. Hancock, not yet 30, had inherited his uncle's shipping business and was one of the wealthiest merchants in Massachusetts. McIntosh, a young shoemaker, was a highly experienced street activist. Many other artisans, tradesmen, printers, tavern keepers, dock workers, and sailors, the middling and lower orders, mobilized to oppose the Stamp Act, taking the name Sons of Liberty. The Boston protest called for a large street demonstration culminating in a mock execution designed to convince Andrew Oliver, the local stamp distributor, to resign. On August 14, 1765, a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 demonstrators, led by McIntosh, hung an effigy of Oliver in a tree and then paraded it around town, before finally beheading and burning it. The royal governor, Francis Bernard, afraid of fueling public anger, took no action. The next day, Oliver announced his resignation. The demonstration provided lessons for everyone. Oliver learned that stamp distributors would be very unpopular. Governor Bernard, lacking a police force, learned the limitations of his power. The demonstration's leaders learned that street action could effect change, and thousands of ordinary people gained confidence in their ability to shape political events. 2 weeks later, a second crowd action showed how well these lessons had been learned. On August 26th, a crowd visited the houses of 3 government officials, breaking windows and raiding wine cellars. The crowd then moved on to the finest dwelling in Massachusetts, owned by Thomas Hutchinson, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and the Chief Justice of the colony's highest court. Rumors abounded that Hutchinson had urged Grenville to adopt the Stamp Act. Although he had actually done the opposite, Hutchinson refused to set the record straight. The crowd attacked his house. By daybreak, only the exterior walls were standing. Governor Bernard gave orders to call out the militia, but he was told that many militiamen were among the crowd. The destruction of Hutchinson's house brought a temporary halt to protest in Boston. The town meeting issued a statement of sympathy for Hutchinson, but a large reward for the arrest and conviction of rioters failed to produce a single lead. The opponents of the Stamp Act in Boston had triumphed. Crowd actions had succeeded where legislative protests had failed. No one replaced Oliver as distributor. When the act took effect on November 1st, ships without stamped permits continued to clear the harbor. Since he could not bring the lawbreakers to court, Hutchinson, ever principled, resigned his office as Chief Justice. He remained Lieutenant Governor, however, and within 5 years became the Royal Governor. One act of Parliament that did not go unnoticed was the Quartering Act of 1765, which forced colonial governments to secure lodgings for contingents of redcoats deployed to colonial cities, specifically to raise funds to build barracks or, failing that, commandeer vacant public buildings to serve in that capacity. They were also responsible for procuring food and wood for fuel for the troops. Legislators complained that the cost of housing and provisioning the king's troops should be the crown's responsibility, especially since most of the redcoats were, at that point, still stationed in forts near the 1763 Proclamation line along the western frontier, but of course that was about to change. Boston's crowd actions sparked similar eruptions in nearly 50 towns throughout the colonies by groups calling themselves Sons of Liberty. Facing widespread resistance and intimidation, stamp distributors everywhere resigned. A Connecticut crowd forced one distributor to throw his hat and powdered wig in the air while shouting a cheer for liberty and property. In Charleston, South Carolina, the stamp distributor resigned after crowds burned effigies and chanted, "Liberty, liberty." Both fared better than another Connecticut stamp agent who was nearly buried alive. Only when the thuds of dirt sounded on his coffin did he scream out his resignation to his tormentors gathered above. Some colonial leaders, disturbed by the increasingly aggressive crowds, sought to challenge the Stamp Act in more moderate ways. In October 1765, 27 delegates representing 9 colonial assemblies met in New York City as the Stamp Act Congress. For 2 weeks, they debated a petition addressed to the king and Parliament. Their statement closely resembled the first 5 Virginia resolves, claiming that taxes were free gifts of the people which only elected representatives could grant. They dismissed the concept of virtual representation. Quote, "The people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be represented in the House of Commons." End quote. At the same time, the delegates carefully affirmed their subordination to Parliament and monarch in deferential language. For all its moderation, the mere existence of the Stamp Act Congress carried radical potential of intercolonial political action that might challenge parliamentary authority. The cries of liberty and property made sense to colonists of many social ranks. Those terms came from a trinity of concepts, life, liberty, property, that had come to be regarded as the birthright of free-born British subjects. Since at least the 17th century, a powerful tradition of British political thought affirmed these rights against abuse by royal authority. To many colonists, therefore, the Stamp Act seemed like a violation of their rights as British subjects. Some colonists perceived a deeper plot behind these taxes, an effort by British leaders to enslave them. In Virginia, a group of planters issued a document called the Westmoreland Resolves, claiming that the Stamp Act was an attempt to, quote, "reduce the people of this country to a state of abject and detestable slavery," end quote. If the opposed meanings of liberty and slavery seemed clear to white colonists, they stopped short of applying similar logic to the nearly 500,000 blacks in actual slavery, people of African descent, who saw the contradiction quite clearly. When a crowd of black Charlestonians paraded with shouts of liberty just a few months after white Sons of Liberty had done the same, the town militia turned out to break up the demonstration. Many people in Britain reacted with alarm to the colonial unrest. Merchants in particular feared trade disruptions and pressured Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. By late 1765, a new minister, the Marquis of Rockingham, headed the king's cabinet and looked for a way to repeal the act without losing face. He persuaded Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act not because it was an ominous change in imperial policy toward the colonists, but because it was obviously unenforceable and would generate no revenue whatsoever. Colonists celebrated the Stamp Act's repeal and drank to the health of Rockingham and King George III, whom they naively credited with recognizing the violation of ancient English liberties through direct taxation. Parliament and the Court of St. James had learned their lessons, and Americans hoped that things could go back to the way they were in the years before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. However, immediately after voting to repeal the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever, end quote. Perhaps the stamp tax had failed, but the power to tax, a prime legislative power, was stoutly upheld. Rockingham did not last long as prime minister. By the summer of 1766, George III had persuaded William Pitt to return to the office. Pitt appointed Charles Townshend as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the chief financial minister. Facing both the war debt and the costs of maintaining British troops in America, Townshend turned again to taxation. His plan to raise revenue touched off coordinated boycotts of British goods in 1768 and 1769. Women, too, became involved in the movement, increasingly politicized as self-styled Daughters of Liberty. Boston once again led the opposition, prompting British authorities to send soldiers to assist the royal governor. Colonial resistance was intensifying. Townshend proposed new taxes in the old form of a Navigation Act. Officially called the Revenue Act of 1767 and popularly known as the Townshend Duties, it established new duties on tea, glass, lead, paper, and painter's colors imported into the colonies. A further reduction in the duty on French molasses had persuaded some American shippers to stop smuggling, and Britain was finally deriving a moderate revenue stream from its colonies. Townshend too hastily concluded that British colonists would accept external taxes. The Townshend duties were not especially burdensome, but the principle they embodied, taxation through trade regulation, looked more threatening to colonists in the wake of the Stamp Act crisis. Colonists' recent insistence on distinguishing between indirect and direct taxes, one whose purpose was to direct the flow of trade, the other whose purpose was to raise revenue, was rendered irrelevant by an external tax meant only to raise money. John Dickinson, a Philadelphia lawyer, articulated this view in an essay titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which circulated widely in late 1767. We are taxed without our consent, Dickinson wrote. We are therefore slaves. Dickinson expanded the colonists' argument against parliamentary taxation, claiming, quote, a total denial of the power of Parliament to lay upon these colonies any tax whatever, end quote. A controversial provision of the Townshend duties directed some of the revenue generated to pay the salaries of royal governors. Previously, colonial assemblies set their governors' salaries, giving them significant influence over crown-appointed officeholders. With this new provision, Townshend aimed to curb the assembly's independence. Massachusetts again led the protests of the Townshend duties. Samuel Adams, now an elected member of the Provincial Assembly, argued that any form of parliamentary taxation was unjust. Further, he contended that the new way of paying governors' salaries subverted the relationship between the people and their rulers. The Assembly circulated a letter with Adams's arguments to other colonial assemblies for their endorsement. As with the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, colonial assemblies started to coordinate their protests. British officials did not look kindly on these actions. Lord Hillsborough, who was in charge of colonial affairs, instructed Massachusetts Governor Barnard to dissolve the assembly if it would not repudiate Adams's letter. The assembly refused by a vote of 92 to 17, and Barnard carried out his instruction. In the summer of 1768, its elected assembly suspended, Boston was in an uproar. Bostonians led the resistance to the Townshend duties by calling for non-consumption agreements to boycott British-made goods. Dozens of other towns passed similar resolutions in 1767 and 68. For example, New Haven, Connecticut prohibited the purchase of carriages, furniture, hats, clothing, lace, clocks, and textiles, among other imported goods. The objective was to encourage home manufacture and to hurt trade, causing London merchants to pressure Parliament for a repeal of the duties. Non-consumption agreements were hard to enforce. With the Stamp Act, there was one hated item, a stamp, and a limited number of official distributors. In contrast, an agreement to boycott all British goods required widespread personal sacrifice and popular solidarity. A more direct blow to trade came from non-importation agreements, but getting merchants to agree proved difficult because of fears that merchants in other colonies might not adhere and might thereby make handsome profits. Not until late 1768 could Boston merchants agree to suspend trade for 1 year starting January 1, 1769. 60 signed the non-importation agreement. New York merchants soon followed suit, as did Philadelphia and Charleston merchants in 1769. Many British products specified in non-consumption agreements were household goods that traditionally were under women's control. By 1769, leaders of the boycott movement recognized that their cause depended on women's cooperation. Resistance to the Townshend duties thus created an unprecedented opening for women's participation in colonial politics. During the Stamp Act crisis, Sons of Liberty took to the streets in protest, expanding the range of political actors beyond the halls of legislative assemblies. During the protests of 1768 and 1769, the concept of Daughters of Liberty emerged to give shape to a new idea, that women were also political actors. Indeed, any woman could join the colonial protest by boycotting British trade goods. Boycott leaders formed committees of inspection to enforce compliance. Any shipper caught importing British goods or exporting American raw materials, merchants selling British goods, and colonists publicly wearing or consuming British goods were all publicly shamed as enemies of the country in pro-boycott newspapers and otherwise intimidated and abused by Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The counterpart to non-consumption was home manufacture, often by women. Quickly, homespun cloth became a prominent badge of patriotism. A young Boston girl learning to spin called herself a Daughter of Liberty, noting that, quote, "I choose to wear as much of our own manufactory as possible," end quote. In the boycott period of 1768 to 1770, newspapers reported on spinning matches, or bees, in some 60 New England towns, in which women publicly came together to make yarn. Newspaper accounts variously called the spinners Daughters of Liberty or Daughters of Industry. This surge of public spinning further expanded the realm of colonial politics, infusing traditional women's work with new political purpose. But there were limits. Female spinners were not equivalents of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons marched in streets, burned effigies, threatened hated officials, and celebrated anniversaries of the movement with raucous drinking in taverns. The Daughters manifested their patriotism more quietly, in actions marked by piety, industry, and charity. These differences were due in part to cultural ideals of gender, which prized masculine self-assertion and feminine selflessness, but they were also due to class. The Sons were a cross-class alliance, with leaders from the middling orders reliant on men and boys of the lower ranks to fuel their crowds. The Daughters, dusting off spinning wheels and shelving their teapots, were genteel ladies accustomed to buying British goods. The difference between the Sons and the Daughters also speaks to two views of how best to challenge authority: violent threats and street actions versus the self-disciplined, self-sacrificing boycott of consumer goods. On the whole, the anti-British boycotts were a success. Imports fell by more than 40%. British merchants felt the sting and let Parliament know. In Boston, the Hutchinson family, whose fortunes rested on British trade, endured substantial losses. But even more alarming to the lieutenant governor, Boston was overrun with anti-ministerial sentiment. The Sons of Liberty staged rollicking annual celebrations of the Stamp Act riot, and both Hutchinson and Governor Bernard concluded that British troops were needed to restore order. In the fall of 1768, 3,000 uniformed troops landed in Boston to pacify the city. The soldiers drilled conspicuously on the town common, played loud music on the Sabbath, and in general grated on the nerves of Puritan Bostonians. Although the situation was often tense, no major troubles occurred that winter and through most of 1769. But as 1770 approached, marking the end of the non-importation agreement, it was clear that some merchants, including Thomas Hutchinson's two sons, were ready to resume trade with Britain. Trouble began in January, when a crowd smeared the door of the Hutchinson brothers' shop with excrement. In February, a crowd surrounded the house of a customs official who panicked and fired a musket, accidentally killing a young boy passing on the street. The Sons of Liberty mounted a massive funeral procession to mark this first violent death in the imperial struggle. For the next week, tension gripped Boston. The discord climaxed on the evening of March 5, 1770, when an angry crowd taunted 8 British soldiers guarding the customs house on King Street. Onlookers threw snowballs and rocks and dared the soldiers to fire. Finally, one did. After a short pause, someone yelled fire, and the other soldiers shot into the crowd, hitting 11 men, killing 5. The Boston Massacre, as colonial protesters quickly labeled the event, was over in minutes. Hutchinson, now acting governor of the colony, courageously addressed the crowd from the State House balcony. He swiftly removed the regiments to an island in the harbor to prevent further bloodshed and jailed Army Captain Thomas Preston and 8 soldiers for their own protection, promising they would be held for trial. In the wake of these events, the Sons of Liberty staged elaborate funeral rituals, turning the 5 victims into martyrs. Significantly, one non-white victim shared equally in the public's veneration, Crispus Attucks, the son of an African man and a Natick Indian woman. A slave in his youth, by 1770 he was a sailor and rope maker in his 40s working on the Boston docks. Attucks was one of the first people to die in the colonial struggle with Britain and certainly the first African American. Years later, he would become a powerful symbol for abolitionists seeking to highlight the participation of African Americans in the Revolution. At trial in the fall of 1770, 2 Boston attorneys, John Adams and Josiah Quincy, ably defended the soldiers. While both supported the resistance with direct ties to leaders of the Sons of Liberty, they believed that even unpopular defendants deserved a fair trial. Samuel Adams respected his cousin's decision to take the case, for there was a tactical benefit as well. It responded to images of Boston as a city of riotous crowds, casting its residents instead as lawful subjects defending traditional British rights. The 5-day trial resulted in acquittal for Preston and 6 soldiers. 2 others were convicted of manslaughter, branded on the thumbs, and released. The very week that violence broke out in Boston, Lord Frederick North became Britain's Prime Minister. The 7th Prime Minister since George III became king a decade earlier. He would serve in that position for the next 12 turbulent years. A skillful politician, Lord North recognized the harmful impact of the boycott on trade and colonial relations and recommended repeal of the Townshend duties. Seeking peace with the colonies and prosperity for British merchants, Lord North persuaded Parliament to remove all the duties except the tax on tea, maintained as a face-saving symbol of parliamentary supremacy. For the next 2 years, colonial tensions ebbed. Then a series of incidents in 1772, followed by a renewed struggle over the tea tax in 1773, precipitated a full-scale crisis in the summer and fall of 1774. In response, representatives from nearly all the colonies gathered in a Continental Congress to debate the future of the British colonies. The Townshend duties repeal brought an end to the non-importation agreements. Driven by the pent-up demand, trade boomed in 1770 and 1771. Meanwhile, the movement's leaders seemed to be losing influence. Samuel Adams, for example, ran for a minor local office and lost to a conservative merchant. Colonists once again seemed content as members of the British Empire. Then, in 1772, several incidents brought the imperial conflict into sharp focus. One was the burning of the Gaspé, a Royal Navy ship pursuing suspected smugglers near Rhode Island. An investigating commission made no arrests, but announced that it would send any suspects to Britain for trial on charges of high treason. This ruling seemed to fly in the face of the traditional English right to trial by a jury of one's peers. When word of the Gaspé investigation spread, other colonies greeted the news with alarm. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee in the Virginia House of Burgesses proposed that a network of standing committees be established to better connect the colonies and share political news. By mid-1773, all but one colonial assembly had set up committees of correspondence. Massachusetts, a continuing hotspot, developed its own rapid communications network. By spring 1773, more than half the towns in Massachusetts had set up committees of correspondence to receive, discuss, distribute, and act on the latest news. The first message to circulate came from Boston. It framed North's plan to pay judges with revenue from tea duties as the latest proof of an ongoing British conspiracy to undermine traditional liberties. First came taxation without consent, then military occupation and a massacre, and then a plot to subvert the justice system. Express riders swiftly distributed the message, which sparked ordinary townspeople to embrace a revolutionary language of rights and constitutional duties. Before long, the committees of correspondence would use this communications network to defend a countryside under attack. The incident that ultimately shattered the calm of the early 1770s, however, was the Tea Act of 1773. After the non-importation movement ended, colonists had resumed buying taxed British tea, but they were also importing much larger quantities of smuggled Dutch tea, undercutting the sales of Britain's East India Company, which began to flounder. In response, Parliament lowered the tax on East India Company tea and, at the same time, allowed the company to sell tea directly to a few selected merchants, cutting out British middlemen. In an ironic twist, the Tea Act of 1773, unlike previous controversial duties, was not designed principally to raise revenue from the colonies. Its intent was to shore up the flagging finances of the East India Company, which was then shouldering increased responsibilities in the new British possessions in India. The effect, which seemed benign to authorities in London, was to lower the retail price of the East India tea below that of smuggled Dutch tea, thus motivating colonists to obey the law. Unfortunately for British officials, colonists saw matters differently. When news of the Tea Act reached the colonies, it struck many colonists as an insidious plot to trick colonists into buying dutied tea. The real goal, some argued, was to reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies, increase revenue to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, and shore up ministerial power in the colonies at the expense of local governance. But how to resist the Tea Act? Non-importation was not viable because the tea trade was too lucrative. Even the most outraged merchants were unlikely to give it up willingly. Consumer boycotts, meanwhile, would inevitably struggle against the difficulty of distinguishing between dutied and smuggled tea. The resistance thus focused on official tea agents, an echo of the Stamp Act distributors. The revived Sons of Liberty pressured them to resign, making it impossible to collect tea duties. Lacking agents, most governors acquiesced, landing cargoes of tea duty-free or sending them home. Governor Hutchinson, however, refused to bend. In November 1773, 3 ships carrying tea arrived in Boston. Sensing extreme tension, their uneasy crews unloaded all the cargo except the tea. The ship captains wanted to return immediately to England, away from the conflict, but Hutchinson would not grant them clearance to leave without paying the tea duty. Adding to the pressure, a long-standing law imposed a 20-day limit for the payment of duties, after which cargo would be confiscated. Hutchinson planned to enforce the law. For 20 days, large crowds kept the pressure high. Then, on December 16th, 5,000 people gathered at Boston's Old South Meeting House to debate the next step. No solution emerged at the meeting, but when it ended, 100 to 150 men disguised as Mohawk Indians, wrapped in blankets with soot-darkened faces, boarded the ships and dumped over 90,000 pounds of tea into the harbor while a crowd of 2,000 bystanders watched in eerie silence. The disguised Sons of Liberty did their work quickly and quietly. One was caught stuffing his pockets with loose tea, and his comrades stripped him naked, threw his clothes into the harbor, and sent him home. Padlocks broken to enter the cargo holds were replaced, and everyone went home, congratulating the Mohawk Nation for its unprecedented support. To imperial authorities, the colonists' actions seemed wildly excessive. Over the previous years, they had continually yielded to colonial sensibilities by abandoning revenue-generating measures, whose purpose, after all, was to pay down the debt of the war that had greatly benefited them. Then, in the wake of a reduction in taxes, they had resorted to mob rule. Their actions could not be allowed to stand. "The crisis has come," declared General Gage, "when the provinces must either be British colonies or independent and separate states." An angry Parliament demanded that Boston arrest known Sons of Liberty, but the town meeting claimed that it was Mohawk Indians who did the deed. Then Parliament demanded that the Massachusetts legislature compensate the British East India Company in the amount of 10,000 pounds sterling, but it argued that this was a criminal matter for Boston to resolve. Lord North now decided to change tack, exchanging carrot for stick. He persuaded Parliament to issue the Coercive Acts, 4 laws intended to punish Massachusetts for destroying the tea. In America, those laws, along with a 5th, the Quebec Act, became known as the Intolerable Acts. The first act, the Boston Port Act, closed Boston Harbor to all shipping as of June 1, 1774, until the cost of the destroyed tea was repaid. The second act, the Massachusetts Government Act, altered the colony's charter by increasing the royal governor's powers. In addition to appointing his own council, the governor could now appoint all judges, sheriffs, and officers of the court. No town meeting beyond the annual spring election of town selectmen could be held without the governor's approval. This measure greatly expanded London's supremacy at the expense of local governance in Massachusetts. The third coercive act, the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, stipulated that any royal official accused of a capital crime, for example, Captain Preston and his soldiers at the Boston Massacre, would be tried in a court either in Canada or Great Britain. This act ominously suggested that more captains and soldiers might soon be firing into unruly crowds or otherwise allowed to get away with capital criminal behavior. The fourth act amended the 1765 Quartering Act, permitting military commanders to lodge soldiers wherever necessary, even in private households. To enforce the acts, Lord North appointed General Gage, the commander of the Royal Army in New York, as governor of Massachusetts, relieving the civilian Thomas Hutchinson of his duties. Military rule now returned to Boston. The Fifth Act was unrelated to the 4 coercive acts, but it magnified colonists' fears. Also passed in 1774, the Quebec Act legalized French civil law and Catholicism in the French territories won by Britain in the 7 Years' War. Granting civil rights to their longtime Catholic enemies struck Protestant New Englanders who had just been denied their own representative government as a shocking outrage. On a more material level, the act made the entire Ohio Valley part of the province of Quebec, nullifying the land claims of the eastern colonies and speculators whose ambitions rested on those claims, and excluding them from the lucrative fur trade in the region. The Quebec Act thus angered land speculators throughout the colonies, but especially in Virginia and the northern colonies, who had hoped to profit from buying land in the Indian Reserve. New Englanders were particularly outraged, as the toleration of Catholicism in Canada signaled to more pious Calvinists that the Church of England seemed to be heading toward a reunion with the Roman Catholic Church. Paul Revere produced a political cartoon showing the Quebec Act as being sponsored by King George III and Lord North, who are depicted as being under direct satanic influence. The 5 intolerable acts spread alarm throughout the colonies. If Britain could subjugate Massachusetts, change its charter, suspend local government, inaugurate military rule, and on top of it all give the Ohio Valley to Catholic Quebec, what liberties were secure? Meanwhile, royal governors in a half-dozen colonies dismissed their sitting assemblies, adding to the sense of urgency. In response to all these measures, colonial leaders agreed to convene in Philadelphia in 1774. The coercive acts provoked New England to open insubordination, with a British general occupying the Massachusetts governorship and some 3,000 troops controlling Boston. The center of protest shifted from urban radicals in Boston to rural farmers throughout the countryside, who launched dozens of spontaneous, dramatic showdowns. Some towns found creative ways to avoid the prohibition on town meetings, while others simply ignored the law. Governor Gage's call for elections for a new provincial assembly under his control sparked the formation of a competing, unauthorized assembly that met in defiance of his orders. Throughout Massachusetts, crowds of armed men closed county courts run by Crown-appointed jurists. No judges were physically harmed, but they were intimidated, forced to resign, and humiliated. By August 1774, farmers and artisans all over Massachusetts, in defiance of royal authority, had taken full control of local institutions. New Englanders began planning for a showdown that now seemed inevitable. Towns stockpiled gunpowder quote-unquote, in case of invasion. Militia officers repudiated the official chain of command to the governor and drilled their units. Town after town withheld tax revenue from the crown and diverted it to military supplies. Governor Gage could do little in response. He wrote London begging for troop reinforcements and beefed up fortifications around Boston, but without more soldiers, his options were limited. Preventing stockpiles of gunpowder from falling into agitators' hands seemed like his best move. An event known as the powder alarm showed how ready colonial settlers were to take up arms against the British government. Early on September 1st, 1774, Gage sent troops to a town outside Boston to remove a store of gunpowder before it slipped from royal control. In the surprise of the mission, false rumors spread that troops had fired on defenders of the storehouse, killing 6. Within 24 hours, thousands of armed men from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut descended on Boston to avenge the supposed deaths. At this moment, ordinary men became insurgents, willing to kill or die in the face of the British clampdown. Once the error was recognized and the crisis defused, everyone returned home peaceably, but Gage could no longer doubt the speed, numbers, and determination of the unruly colonists. This vast mobilization had occurred without orchestration by Boston radicals, Gage reported. British leaders found that hard to believe. How could, quote, a tumultuous rabble, one official wrote, quote, without any appearance of general concert or without any head to advise or leader to conduct, end quote, rise up so effectively? In the years to come, British authorities would repeatedly underestimate their opponents. 12 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in September 1774. The gathering in Philadelphia included notables such as Samuel Adams and John Adams from Massachusetts and George Washington and Patrick Henry from Virginia. Only Georgia was unrepresented. To moderate the most radical voices, a few colonies sent representatives who hoped to ease tensions with Britain, like Pennsylvania's Joseph Galloway. Delegates discussed their liberties as British subjects and Parliament's powers over colonial settlers and debated various responses to the coercive acts. Some wanted a total ban on trade with Britain, while others, especially Southerners dependent on tobacco and rice exports, opposed such a dramatic measure. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry advocated for a ringing denunciation of all parliamentary control. The conservative Joseph Galloway proposed a quickly defeated plan for a secondary parliament in America to assist the British Parliament in ruling the colonies. After 7 weeks of debate and discussion, the Congress produced a declaration grounded in the delegates' idea of traditional British rights. Quote, "We ask only for peace, liberty, and security. We wish no diminution of royal prerogatives. We demand no new rights." End quote. From the perspective of imperial officials, however, these constituted radical claims to new rights. British authorities particularly chafed at the idea that colonists were not represented in Parliament and that colonial governments alone had the sole right to govern and tax. The colonists' only concession to parliamentary authority was a carefully worded statement that they would, quote-unquote, cheerfully consent to trade regulations for the larger good of the empire, so long as these were not intended to raise revenue. To pressure British authorities, the delegates agreed to a gradually expanding trade boycott. Imports prohibited the first year, exports the following, and rice totally exempted to keep South Carolinians happy. To enforce the boycott, they called for a continental association, with chapters in each town variously called Committees of Public Safety or Inspection. These committees would monitor all commerce and punish suspected violators of the boycott, just as their predecessors had done. Sometimes they did this with a bucket of tar and a bag of feathers to threaten anyone who defied them. Its work done, the Congress disbanded with agreement to reconvene in May. The Committees of Public Safety, the Committees of Correspondence, the regrouped colonial assemblies, and the Continental Congress were all political bodies functioning defiantly without any constitutional authority. British officials did not recognize them as legitimate, but colonists, angered by Parliament's actions, instantly accepted them. Mostly composed of men who had held elective office before, these unauthorized governing bodies proved to be remarkably stable. Parliament's harsh reaction to the Boston Tea Party radicalized colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia. It led them to see problems with British rule far beyond issues of taxation. The coercive acts violated traditional liberties and suppressed long-standing institutions of colonial self-government. They could not be ignored. With one colony already subject to military rule and a British army camped in Boston, the threat of a general war loomed. It is vitally important here that we remind ourselves that what was happening in the early 1770s was a heated political argument between Britain and its colonial possessions that were rapidly becoming fully mature societies with highly developed political institutions that, with the exception of Georgia, had existed for a century, some for much longer than that. An imperial administrative system that limited itself to trade regulation and economic management shifted, by necessity, toward pushing these fairly wealthy mainland provinces into carrying a heavier share of supporting the British Empire following the ruinously expensive victory over France in the 7 Years' War. We mustn't allow our knowledge that this is quickly going to lead to a successful revolution to interpret the events of 1775 as the beginning of an inevitable war for American independence and the formation of the United States. Delegates to the Continental Congress in 1774 and the second meeting the following year held out hopes for reconciliation even as redcoats began spilling American blood at Bunker Hill in Massachusetts and Kemp's Landing in Virginia. It is important here to note that military service was looked upon very differently in the 18th century. A career in any European military was only ever seriously undertaken by members of the nobility or the landed gentry, and they did not enlist as privates and work their way up through the ranks due to their skills and ambition. In nearly every case, these men were the third and later sons of nobles who had willed nearly everything to their eldest sons. Second sons often joined the clergy, and other sons might do so as well, but that usually led to something good like a bishopric or higher only if one is already pretty high up on the social ladder. However, a stellar career in the army or the navy could take a lesser son of a minor noble to places that can elevate a family to higher status. So, the head of a noble or gentry family would cultivate connections with higher-ranking people who could help secure a commission as an officer. The higher up one is on the social ladder, the higher one's rank can be at the beginning of their career, and the more likely they will be to be promoted to the higher echelons of the officer corps. Some knowledge or expertise was helpful, of course, but by no means necessary, so it was not unusual for a 19 or 20-year-old Briton to begin his career as a captain in the regular army or as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy while having absolutely no military experience. Now, what about the rank-and-file soldiers? Unlike today, where it is generally considered noble and honorable to enlist in the armed forces and can be the beginning of an excellent career, recruits to the Army or the Navy often did so against their will or with enormous reluctance. They came almost exclusively from the ranks of the poor, and for many it was the only way out of a life of crime or crushing poverty. Oftentimes, judges would sentence criminals to service in the military in lieu of public whipping, bodily mutilation, or worse. The Navy routinely employed hardened sailors to serve as press gangs that would roam through a port city or town looking for homeless people to kidnap and force into service, while crew members of a ship captured in a battle or seized for smuggling might also be pressed into service. The fresh recruits and their new comrades were subject to brutal discipline from their officers in order to forge them into soldiers and sailors who will charge into battle without hesitation, not because they are filled with a patriotic rage militaire, so much as they feared the consequences should they hesitate or disobey orders. Minor infractions were punished with flogging, while deserters and those accused of more serious crimes were subjected to drumhead trials and summarily hanged or killed by a firing squad. But this did only a little to prevent soldiers from engaging in a vast array of crimes of all sorts, as well as from deserting altogether. The private or seaman who showed considerable bravery and skill on the battlefield could never hope to become an officer. Those positions were reserved for the gentry and the nobility. So the passage of the new Quartering Act in 1774 meant that in the event that a colonial government refused to provide barracks for the king's troops, officers would go about billeting their men in private homes, and it was up to the residents to provide for their new housemates, most of whom are not the kind of men you want to live with. Some troopers might feel a sense of honor and duty attached to their service and behave themselves, but more often than not they felt little or no obligation to conduct themselves honorably. Now, let us take a moment to look at 18th century weapons technology. European armies were comprised of essentially three units: infantry, cavalry, and artillery, of which the first was by far the largest and most important. Infantrymen carried muskets, all of which featured barrels that were smooth on the inside, known as smooth-bore muskets. Rifling, the boring of a barrel using a tool that cuts a spiral groove down the entire length of the barrel, had been around for some time by the 1770s, but rifled muskets were hard to make and thus very expensive, and at that time hard to maintain. A ball fired down a rifled barrel is spun by the grooves and comes out following a fairly straight and highly accurate trajectory. However, the barrels were prone to overheating and warped after a relatively short time in use, whereas the smoothbore musket was much more durable and reliable, and in any case cheaper to make and thus easier on military expenditure accounts. The British carried a weapon they called the Brown Bess, while the Americans used identical muskets and hunters' fowling pieces of their own manufacture and later French muskets. A musket's accuracy was highly dependent upon the proximity of the target, since the ball fired down the barrel exited the gun on a trajectory that could be anywhere within an initially narrow but ever widening cone. You would not want your target to be much more than 30 yards away to have the best chance of hitting it, and beyond 50 yards your chances of a hit significantly decrease with distance. As a result, 18th century armies fighting in large open fields clumped their infantry close together in ranks and files in order to concentrate devastating musket volleys on the enemy. Battles would be tough back and forth affairs as armies moved closer and closer to each other, each hoping that the other would take enough damage to disorder them, at which point the side with the advantage might then launch a bayonet charge to put the enemy to flight. A bayonet is a very large sort of grooved knife that could be attached to the end of a musket barrel and then used to run through an opponent. There were strict rules of engagement, an etiquette for fighting, if you will, that privileged the safety of the officers on both sides and helped minimize chaos and confusion on a smoky and very noisy battlefield. The colonial militia had a very different organization and experience of fighting than the British regulars. For one thing, while the officer corps came from the prominent men of a particular community, it was not unusual for a talented militiaman to be elected to an officer's position, so American militias were astonishingly democratic. Also, their military experience was mostly limited to fighting Indians on the heavily wooded frontier, and it was well known that the Indians did not fight according to the strict rules that governed European military engagements. An Indian war party would be a small group that preferred to fire at their foes from the cover of trees, bushes, or rocks from as close a range as possible, launching surprise attacks on an unwary opponent. American militia learned to fight in a similar fashion, and this caused a lot of tension between them and the regulars when they had to work together during the French and Indian War. Another wrinkle was created by a rule stating that the highest-ranking militia officer was subordinate to the lowest-ranking British officer, and this caused a great deal of resentment. Nevertheless, the Americans learned a lot from observing the British in the field, and some British officers urged the adoption of frontier fighting tactics, which were sternly rejected by generals. They were strongly of the opinion that the Americans were ignorant and practically useless in battle except as cannon fodder, and therefore nowhere near the equal of the British regular soldier. As tensions between the Americans and the British grew in 1773 and 1774, both sides dreaded the prospect of a direct confrontation between militia and the regulars. During the winter of 1774 to 75, British colonists continued their boycott. Optimists hoped for a repeal of the coercive acts. Pessimists stockpiled arms and ammunition. In Massachusetts, militia units, known as Minutemen, prepared to defend the countryside from the British troops in Boston. Thomas Gage recognized the fragility of the imperial government's position. The people, Gage wrote Lord North, were, quote, numerous, worked up to a fury, and not a Boston rabble, but the freeholders and farmers of the country, end quote. He requested 20,000 reinforcements. He also strongly advised repeal of the coercive acts, but this time leaders in London were unwilling to retreat. Instead, they doubled down on existing policy. Gage planned a surprise seizure of an ammunition storage site at Concord, a village 18 miles west of Boston. Near midnight on April 18th, as Gage's troops crossed the Charles River, Bostonians Paul Revere and William Dawes raced ahead to alert the Minutemen. The Lexington militia were the first to gather in the hours before dawn. Numbering around 70 men commanded by Captain John Parker, they mustered on the green which stood next to the road leading from Boston to Concord. The British column of 700 troops, led by a Major Pitcairn, could have marched his men past the militia without incident, but, irritated by this entirely token show of force, ordered them to halt and face the Americans. "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse," he barked at them. What did they do? They began to comply, of course. The sight of professional soldiers armed with bayonets gleaming in the morning sunlight tends to loosen the bowels, and so Parker ordered his men to lay down their guns and leave the green. But then a shot rang out. Nobody knows what really happened. It is possible that one of the militiamen fired a shot in anger, but more likely somebody's musket may have gone off half-cocked or discharged when tossed onto the ground. In any case, others began to fire, thinking that an order had gone out that maybe they just didn't hear, which caused others to fire as well, and so a short firefight ensued. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans were killed and 10 wounded, while 1 British soldier took a musket ball to his leg. The men of Lexington scattered when Pitcairn ordered a bayonet charge, and, having taken the field, the British resumed their march to Concord, any pretense of surprise now gone. 3 companies of Minutemen nervously occupied the town center, but did not challenge the professional soldiers as they searched in vain for the ammunition. Finally, at the Old North Bridge in Concord, British troops and Minutemen exchanged shots, killing 2 colonists and 3 British soldiers. Pitcairn ordered a retreat toward Boston to link up with Gage's reinforcements. Near Arlington, they began to chase down those Americans they could find, which only served to bring more American militiamen out to join the fight. British discipline began to break down, and Pitcairn ordered his men to break off their counterattack and return to Boston. Past Cambridge, the British march turned into a jog and then into a dead run, as they had to flee a gauntlet of sniper fire by about 500 militiamen. All told, 273 British redcoats were killed, while 95 Americans were slain, and official reports to Gage claimed that the British had been attacked by no fewer than 5,000 rebels. News of the battles of Lexington and Concord spread fast. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson exclaimed that, quote, "A frenzy of revenge seems to have seized all ranks of people," end quote. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, removed all gunpowder from the Williamsburg powder house to a ship out of the reach of angry Virginians. He also threatened to arm slaves in response to the colonists' insurrection. The threat proved effective for several months. In November 1775, as the crisis deepened, Dunmore made good on his threat. He issued a proclamation promising freedom to slaves who would fight for the British. Dunmore had no intentions of abolishing slavery. Indeed, as some observers noted, he did not even free his own slaves. Nonetheless, within a month, some 1,500 slaves had joined Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. Camp diseases quickly set in: dysentery, typhoid fever, and smallpox. When Dunmore sailed for England in mid-1776, he left with 300 former slaves. The Association of Freedom with the British authorities had been established, and during the war thousands more would flee American enslavement as the British Army approached. From north to south, slaves pressed their case. Several enslaved Bostonians offered to fight for the British in exchange for freedom, but General Gage turned them down. In Maryland, a planter worried that blacks impatient for freedom had to be disarmed of about 80 guns along with some swords. In North Carolina, white suspicions about a planned slave uprising led to the arrest of scores of African Americans. The Revolutionary Committee of Public Safety ordered them to be punished by whipping. As many as 20,000 slaves had gained their freedom by fleeing to the British Army by 1783, when the War for Independence ended. About half succumbed to disease, especially smallpox, in refugee camps. But some 8,000 to 10,000 left America with the British Army to start new lives of freedom in Canada's Nova Scotia or Africa's Sierra Leone. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the victors lost their spoils. Indeed, everyone seemed to come out the worst. France lost its North American empire. Indian land rights were increasingly violated. And Britain's huge war debt and subsequent revenue-generating policies set the stage for an imperial crisis. For more than a century, British authorities had tolerated extensive colonial self-government, largely because they had no choice. Political power in distant lands necessarily rested on some level of consent, and over decades of innumerable local negotiations, a delicate equilibrium had emerged that balanced the demands of settlers with the needs of the imperial state. It was only in the wake of the 7 Years' War, when the needs of the British state grew, triggering attempts at administrative reform, that the delicate balance was upended. "What can a governor do without the assistance of the governed?" exclaimed a Philadelphia customs official in 1770. "What can the magistrate do unless they are supported by their fellow citizens?" Colonial resistance to imperial policy grew slowly but steadily. As British policies provoked anger in the colonies, officials in London looked across the Atlantic and increasingly saw rebellious colonists who needed to be brought to heel. Colonists, meanwhile, looked toward the imperial capital, increasingly saw in British policy a concerted effort to deprive them of their liberties. Neither view was correct at first, but as each side dug into its position, each brought its imagined fears about the other to reality. Britain did ultimately abrogate colonists' traditions of self-government and their right to live free of an occupying army, while colonists did ultimately rebel. None of these outcomes had been intended in 1763. By 1775, both had come to pass. Meanwhile, African Americans experiencing actual slavery listened to shouts of liberty from white crowds and appropriated the language of revolution to their own circumstances. Defiance of authority was indeed contagious. Even after the battles of Lexington and Concord, many colonists sought to halt a slide into a civil war. Long-standing imperial loyalties died hard. In the months ahead, American colonial leaders pursued peaceful as well as military solutions to the imperial crisis. Let's remind ourselves, this is not yet a revolution.